Well, as I've already indicated, and this morning's message is going to be about miracles. Miracles and Jesus, Jesus and miracles. The two go together. And I asked the kids what miracles they kind of remembered, and they came up with a bunch. And I thought I would just kind of scroll through just a few examples of miracles as well. I think some of the ones we think of especially are the miracles of healing. And so we think of Jesus, what's he doing here? Jesus dealing with a man who has leprosy and healing that awful disease. And Jesus healing people who are blind. And we remember the story of the woman who had the bleeding issue and touched Jesus' cloak and was healed. And one of the more kind of interesting ones where there was a centurion who had a servant who was sick, and Jesus healed that servant without even coming close to him, just from a distance. And then Jesus healed some people who were dead. You know, Jairus' daughter who was raised from the dead, and Lazarus who was dead for 4 days that Jesus brought back to life. And then there were some of the miracles that involved nature. And his very, very first one, turning water into wine. And the one that one of the children also talked about when Jesus fed the 5,000 and another time of 4,000. Or the time when Jesus walked on water. Or the time that he just spoke and a storm ended. And the different kind of miracle. One of the children mentioned this at the very end, where Jesus dealt with evil forces and cast demons out, and in the one case into a herd of pigs. So Jesus did all kinds of these miracles, and we read about them in the New Testament. And I think we have to agree that these miracles are pretty incredible. And if we weren't raised in a church, we might have some difficulty accepting whether or not they really happened. And I would guess that there are a few people here this morning who do sometimes wonder, did this stuff really happen or not? And so I'd like to spend just a few minutes at the beginning here just talking about why it does make some sense to believe in these miracles. Why you don't have to sort of, put your brain on the shelf for a while in order to accept that these stories really, really did happen. There are some that just outright say miracles are impossible. They go against the laws of nature. That never happens. So miracles couldn't possibly happen. But that's not quite fair. You've already decided the issue before you've even investigated it. It's sort of a circular argument. And I like to give the example in school when I talk about this sometimes of when some of the first explorers to Australia discovered a platypus. Platypus is a mammal that lays eggs. It has the bill of a duck. It's a very strange animal. And evidently, the first time they got a platypus and sent the pelt, I guess we could call it, like the dead platypus, back to England, scientists there dismissed it. It's just not possible. Mammals don't lay eggs. Mammals don't have duck bills. Because it didn't fit what they already decided was true and wasn't true. And so to just say, right off the top, miracles are impossible. Therefore, anytime I hear about a miracle, it couldn't have happened. That's not quite fair. Another way that some people dismiss miracles, they say, well, what happened is that, Jesus was a good guy. He said a lot of amazing things, and people really admired him. And then after some years went by, people began to, well-meaning people, well-intentioned people, began to spin some kind of pretty fantastic stories. They made Jesus a little larger than life. And after a while, after some years had gone by and people, weren't so aware of the actual facts, these big exaggerations occurred. And that's what happened. But you can't argue that. That's not, you can't historically argue that, because where do we read about all these miracles? We read them in, some things were written by eyewitnesses that have made their way into the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these descriptions weren't really written all that long after the miracles actually happened. Now, people argue about when exactly the Gospels were written. Some people would say that Mark was written as recently as 20 years after the events. Most would say 30, 40, 50 years after the events is when the Gospels were actually written. Although that seems like quite a long time afterwards, it's really not. Because if you take something like 40 years ago, we're talking the 1980s, right? So if somebody in this audience here started writing about something that happened in the 1980s, maybe something that happened here in the church in the 1980s, and you put in all kinds of fantastic stories, you're not going to get away with that. It's way too close. And same with the Gospels. When they were written, there were lots and lots of people around who had actually experienced things, who had seen Jesus. And if you just sort of made up all these fantastic stories, you couldn't get away with it. So that's not a valid explanation. A third thing is that the documents which are now in the Gospels, they are eyewitness accounts or accounts written by people who interviewed eyewitnesses. It's true. I mean, Matthew saw this stuff. John saw these things. Mark was perhaps as a boy, he saw some of it, we don't know, but Mark evidently spent a lot of time with Peter, and Peter was his main source for the stories that he wrote. And Luke was a highly educated doctor, a Greek, who, as he tells us, he very carefully researched, talks to lots of different people, and wrote the gospel we know as Luke. So you've got here a number of accounts written by either eyewitnesses or people who talked to eyewitnesses, and this is what they say happened. These are the kind of documents that, for myself as an amateur historian, this is primary source material. This is the stuff that you really want to find. This is stuff that's golden, stuff written by people who actually were there. And they say, and there's 4 different accounts, they all say that Jesus did some amazing, very hard things to believe, that he actually did them. So you can't just dismiss those. And we also have to be careful that we don't sort of arrogantly write off first century people as being sort of naive and gullible and maybe not as intelligent as us. I mean, people back then were people just like us. They understood that paralyzed people don't just get up and walk. They knew that leprosy doesn't suddenly vanish just like that. They knew that dead people stay dead. And yet, they say these things happened. And when you read the description of those miracles and the description of how the people reacted, their reactions are exactly what you would expect when somebody does something which is really impossible, and yet it happens. And the surprise and the astonishment and almost the disbelief that we read about in the Gospels fits exactly with how you would expect people to act when something like that really happens. So, they're believable. But let's take a look at some of the miracles that we see in the Gospel of Mark. And I picked the Gospel of Mark because, it's the first Gospel, and there's a number of miracles that Jesus did that are all put together, sort of kind of all in a row. So if you would like, I would encourage you to take the Bible maybe out of the pew rack and turn to Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1. And we're going to start at verse 21. Mark chapter 1, verse 21. And it follows right after the initial calling of the first few disciples. A couple of weeks ago, Norm Visser shared a message on that. So this is kind of good timing. This happens just a little bit after that. He only has some of the disciples and at the very beginning of his ministry. We'll start at verse 21. I think it's page 1074 in those Bibles. So they, that is Jesus and his disciples, went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. It was a setting much like this. A synagogue is like a church. Our church in many ways is modeled after synagogues, and so here's a group of people. And Jesus was kind of doing what I'm doing right now. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. And just then, a man in the synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." That must have been really weird if you think about it. Like if somebody in this room suddenly jumped up right now and interrupted me and started yelling something, that'd be really weird. And yet, and I'm sure it was just as odd for them as it would be for us. And yet it happened. And that person who perhaps had quietly, warmed the pew for many, many weeks and months and years was a man who was demon-possessed. And in the presence of Jesus, that suddenly became evident. And Jesus says sternly, we read in verse 25, "Be quiet, come out of him." And the evil spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. It's the power of Jesus here. He just says, "Be quiet." And that demon has to leave. Verse 27, the people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching? And with authority?" That is, Jesus had not referred to other rabbis and commentaries and things like that. He just said, this is the way it is. It says, and he even gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him. And news about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. Continuing on. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. We do this too sometimes, don't we? After church, some of you folks go to mom and dad's house for dinner, or to some friend's place for dinner, and that's what's happening here, exactly. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. And the fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The reason they waited till after sunset is because this was the Sabbath. And according to Sabbath law, healing was work. Plus, you weren't even supposed to walk very far on the Sabbath. It was very, very limited how far you could walk. So they waited. They're good Jews. They wait till the sun's down, and then they're sort of set free. And then they all show up at Peter's place, Simon Peter's place. So the whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. And then there's a section here about Jesus praying early in the morning. I'll skip that because it's not so relevant for what we have to do today. And we'll go to verse 40. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." So that man somehow understood the power of Jesus. And of course, leprosy is something we read about in the Bible a lot, and that was a particularly dread disease. I mean, it was fatal. That, of course, would make it scary enough, but it was a slow, sort of a wasting disease where because you lost your sense of feeling, eventually different parts of your body would become injured, and maybe eventually you would lose some fingers and so on. But also another part of it, which made it really, really, really difficult, is that they understood that it was contagious. And because of that, anybody who had leprosy was barred from being around any other person. They had to live outside somewhere. I think, in fact, if they even walked near an area where people lived, they had to ring a bell or something to let people know, or at least yell out, "Unclean, unclean." So they had no human contact anymore. Their family, if they were married, their spouse, if they had children, they had no more contact with them. They were social outcasts. And that must have hurt as much or maybe more even than the disease. And that's why it's so interesting what Jesus does here. Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and he touched the man. He touched the man. This is a man who everybody ran away from. This is a man whose physical appearance would probably be disgusting. He had a skin disease, or at least it showed itself that way. But Jesus touched him. He's probably the first sort of regular person who had touched this man in perhaps some years. And Jesus didn't have to touch him, of course, right? He could have just said a word, but he touched him because he understood that that man craved human touch. And he said, and it says immediately, he says, "I am willing." And Jesus said, "Be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. And Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, Show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, this healed guy went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. And as a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. And I think they were coming probably primarily for healing. Continuing on in the first part of chapter 2. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. So many gathered that there was no room left, not even outside the door. And he preached the word to them. And I think that's what Jesus wanted to do primarily, preach the word. I think he was more interested in that than in healing. In fact, I'm convinced that he was. But some men came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 of them. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus, and after digging through it, lowered the mat the paralyzed man was lying on. By the way, this is a little easier to understand when you realize that most first-century Jews lived in houses with a flat roof. And they would often have an even outside sort of staircase because people would go on the roof fairly often. And the roofs were made basically of kind of like packed mud. And you could literally dig through that roof if you so desired. But yeah, that must have been quite something. You know, these people in that house, and they must have heard some noise and maybe eventually some little bits of pieces of things fell down, and then here comes somebody through the roof. Quite a commitment on the part of those friends as well. They were certainly going the extra mile. I think a lot of us would say if we found that Jesus was busy and you couldn't get in the door, we'd say, well, we tried, can't do it. But these folks, that wasn't enough for them. They did whatever they thought would work. But Jesus, when he sees their faith, when he encounters this man, he doesn't respond in the way we would predict. Because in verse 5 it says here, when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." He came maybe for healing, physical healing, but his sins are forgiven. Now, some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And they were right, at least partially right. It's true. Only God can forgive sins. I can't come up to anybody over here and say, I forgive your sins. I can't do that. Only God can forgive sins. And they understood that. They just didn't realize who was there with them. Well, immediately Jesus knew in his spirit that this is what they were thinking in their hearts. And he said to them, why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat and walk? And the answer, of course, is obvious. But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. And he said to the paralytic, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. And he got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. And this amazed everyone. And they praised God, saying, we've never seen anything like this. So what can we learn about Jesus from all these miracles that he did? I'd like to spend a few minutes in conclusion just kind of looking at that. Well, first of all, one of the things we notice about Jesus is that unlike perhaps some so-called miracle workers today, Jesus never did miracles to draw attention to himself. Never. He wasn't some kind of a health and wealth preacher looking for fame. And he certainly didn't ask for money. In fact, he did the opposite. He told people to not tell anybody, keep it all undercover. Jesus, I think we can conclude, was interested especially in that people would not come to him for miracles, but would come to him for spiritual healing. That's what he was interested in primarily. Secondly, I think the miracles clearly reveal that Jesus cares about people. Especially maybe back then, before they had hospitals and modern medicine, there were a lot of hurting people, a lot of people dealing with issues that maybe sometimes we could go to a doctor and receive some help for. So a lot of people in a lot of trouble. And he cared. He reached out to so many. We just read about a bunch of these examples right over there. And there are some other examples we read in the Gospels where a person didn't even ask for healing. But Jesus just saw a need, and he went out there and met it. And he often seemed to reach out to those who hurt the most, like lepers. Like one time we read about a widow who had lost her only son. Or that woman we mentioned earlier on who had spent all that she had on doctors and who was sick with something that made her a social outcast. These miracles show that Jesus cares about hurting people. I think also these miracles give us a little bit of a preview or a peek into what Jesus is going to do on a far grander scale in his second coming. In his first coming, yes, he does heal some people. He does raise some people from the dead, although then later on they're going to die again, right? And he does cast out some demons, but it's basically temporary. But in his second coming, sickness is going to be dealt with completely. Death will be dealt with completely. In fact, the scriptures indicate that we're hardly going to even remember that that's what life was once like. And in his second coming, he's also going to deal with evil completely. You know, in the first century, he cast out demons. But in his second return, Satan's going to be defeated completely. And sin is going to be dealt with totally in all of our lives. And, we're going to begin an existence which is perfect. So his miracles, his healings, his raising people from the dead, his casting out demons, give us a little bit of a peek into what Jesus is going to do in a much fuller way in his second coming. I think also as we look at these miracles, we can observe that Jesus is interested actually more in spiritual healing than in physical healing. I think that's kind of evident when we read that story about the paralyzed man who got left through the roof. He was interested especially in that man being forgiven. And there's another story that I haven't referred to yet, which I think that also is shown an interesting story, sort of an atypical healing, where Jesus sought out a man who was paralyzed, who was laying next to the pool of Bethesda. Kind of a grouchy guy, actually, because when Jesus asked him, what he wanted, he just sort of complained a little bit. But Jesus healed him, and then later eventually that man actually turned in Jesus to the Pharisees. He's not a nice guy. And Jesus found him sometime after he healed him, and Jesus said to that man, "See, you're well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." So clearly, Jesus was telling him, you're better physically, but there's something more important that you really need. And that's still true. Jesus is more interested in our spiritual healing than our physical healing. And maybe that's one of the reasons why there's so few miracles that happen today. Jesus is still far more interested in healing broken relationships, in healing broken hearts, and sin being dealt with. Physical healing is only temporary. Spiritual healing is for eternity, and it's healing at a much deeper level. But probably the most important reason, well, maybe not, but one of the most important reasons why Jesus did miracles is for something else as well. Jesus was a great preacher. He was profound. Nobody fell asleep during his sermons. Nobody ever complained that he was boring. They may not like what he said, but nobody was bored by what he said. But there have been some other pretty good preachers as well. Not as good as Jesus, but there are some pretty amazing preachers out there. But what set Jesus really, really apart from everyone else is the miracles. No one has ever done miracles like Jesus. There's never been anybody, even sort of mythologically, they've made claims that he did the kind of miracles that Jesus did. And that sets Jesus apart. And those miracles gave and still give authority to what he said and to the claims that he made. And these miracles ultimately reveal that Jesus is no ordinary person. He's no ordinary person. He's divine. And that concept that Jesus is God was, of course, completely foreign to first century Jews, and it's still challenging, of course, to us today. And these miracles, more than anything else perhaps, gave witness to the fact that you're dealing with somebody that's very, very unique. What are you going to do with him? And we see that in a number of different things that Jesus says and that we read about in the scriptures. I want to look at just 4 of them. First of all, Nicodemus, when he came and visited Jesus at night. And Nicodemus was the kind of a person who normally, he was from a group that didn't appreciate Jesus typically. He was a Pharisee, he was a member of the Sanhedrin. But Jesus says to, Nicodemus says to Jesus, and I read here, he says, "Rabbi, we know you're a teacher who has come from God." So how do you know that? "For no one could perform the miraculous signs you are doing if God were not with him." So the miracles were key for Nicodemus realizing that Jesus was somebody very special. And of course, Nicodemus eventually became a disciple, and along with Joseph of Arimathea, buried Jesus. For the disciples, one of the miracles that he did, the miracle when he just spoke and the storm ended, we read that here in Luke 8. "In fear and amazement, these disciples asked one another, 'Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him.'" And they had seen a lot of amazing things before, but this was just too much. If I remember correctly, Peter just kind of fell down in front of him and said, "Get away from me, get away from me." He understood that he was dealing with somebody and something that was just so much bigger than anything I've ever encountered before. When Jesus talked with the Pharisees near the end of his ministry, he also referred to his miracles. In John 10, we read, as he's talking to these people who are challenging them, he says, "Even though you don't believe me, you don't believe what I say, believe the miracles, that you may learn and understand that the Father is in me and I in the Father." He's basically saying, I'm God. And he's saying, believe it because of the miracles you've seen me do. And he said the same thing to the disciples in John 14, that last, as part of a long conversation that Jesus had with his disciples that last evening before he was arrested and then taken out and crucified. And he says to the disciples as well, he says, "Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me." Or, at least believe on the evidence of the miracles themselves. So he says, I told you lots and lots of times, and I've showed you lots and lots of things, but if you still don't believe just because I'm telling you, believe because of those miracles you've seen me do. Believe that I am the Son of God. So, what do we do with all of this? And what are you doing with Jesus? The people in the synagogue where Jesus cast out the demon wondered at Jesus' teaching and were impressed by the miracle. But were they interested in following him? I suspect most of them were not really ready to do that. The time when Jesus healed the 5,000? This is an amazing miracle when you think about it. What was the result of that? Did all these people become disciples and followers? No, they kind of tried to find him back again so that he could feed them some more free food. That's kind of what they were interested in. So what about us? What are we doing with this miracle worker? Do we truly believe he's God's son? Are we willing to accept his authority and follow him? He still wants to make people whole, and he's still primarily interested in spiritual healing. I think it's good for each one of us to ask ourselves every once in a while, have we come to him for that spiritual healing? One last text here from John 20, where John, the Apostle John, who had seen all of this stuff, near the end of his gospel, he writes this for those of us who read it. "Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these," that is the miracles we've been talking about, "are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." It's been my prayer, and I'll pray for that even right now, that this would be true for each one of us, that we would believe in Jesus Christ, that he's the Son of God, and would find life in his name. Let's pray. Lord God, that is my prayer, that is our prayer, that everyone gathered here and that everyone listening online or wherever way they do, that every one of us would recognize that you, Jesus, are the Son of God, that you've come to this world to save us, that salvation is in you, and that forgiveness of sin is in you, that spiritual healing, which is far more important than physical healing, is available. Lord, may that be something that each one of us knows for sure and accepts. We pray this